Thank you, everybody that joins today the webinar organized by ELODIZ and ELODIZ. The umbrella of the Charisma project is a European project to try to harmonize Raman spectroscopy. And ELODIZ, as a partner and manufacturer of Raman solutions, we are very pleased to be here today to present some of the results that we have been working on for the last few years and how these apply to real case study that is our instrumentation. So how have all these proposals been implemented in our instruments? So the title of the webinar is Demystifying Raman Spectroscopy, a guide for data calibration, verification, and harmonization of the data. And it's going to be presented by myself, Enrique Lozano, Managing Director of ELODIZ, and my colleague, Dr. James Thomson, that will go through the second part of the presentation. So without more delays, let's get started. So ELODIZ, a very brief introduction of who we are, just because we have been in the background for many years working with other companies. ELODIZ is a company that started in 2012, and we have been working with a number of companies helping develop the Raman spectroscopy, other spectroscopy. We decided to change the focus of the business in 2019-2020 and start producing and developing our own products. In 2020, we started the Charisma project of Harmonisation Raman, and in 2021, we started introducing our own solutions for Raman spectroscopy. So the main topic today is why standards and why they are changing. So particularly in Raman shift, technical issues. Raman shift is critical for consistency on the data, intensity calibration, and Raman resolution. Many of these actual standards do not cover the actual portfolio of products that are available on the market. There is a need as well for precision that was not necessary 20 years ago. There is more and more applications based on chemometrics and quantification. The actual standards lack a little bit of precision to assure the quality of the data. So, and it's as well a very good exercise always to do a critical revision of the work. So one of the starting points of those projects that has been sponsored by the European Union is one of the Nature articles in 2016 with some researchers putting down the amount of reproducibility that were available on the data. So there is a real case where there is numbers of publications that cannot be easily reproduced. So we try to correct that, at least for the Raman spectroscopy. So what is the problem of Raman spectroscopy? Well, there is no real problem. There is small deviations that need to be addressed. For example, when you analyze the calibration protocols that they are described in the different standards, you can see that there is plenty of problems, for example, with emission lines. The emission lines are not clean emission lines, unless you have a very expensive one. And even so, it's very difficult to differentiate what is spectra that correspond to the real peak, or what is the error that introduced those contaminants. The problem as well of reproducibility of the data. For example, this example of one peak of polystyrene using 5 different instruments. Polystyrene is polystyrene, but there is a small difference in between peaks. It is perfectly observable. And then the most serious problem that we have observed is that, for example, some regulations like pharmacopoeias do not have standardized values that they can be extrapolated across the different instrumentation. This is, for example, the case of the European pharmacopoeia, the Chinese pharmacopoeia, and the EST values that are used for European and American pharmacopoeia. There is one particular peak, that, for example, in polystyrene, described by the ASTM and described by the Japanese pharmacopoeia. They don't overlap at all. So which one needs to be used? That causes a significant problem at the moment that you need to validate an instrument for Raman spectroscopy in the pharmaceutical market. So the standardization bodies are there, and they are working today to introduce changes. ISO is working in new standards, ISC is working in new standard, ASTM is working to update those standards. But nevertheless, the process of standardization is extremely slow and takes a very, very long time. So who is going to be interested to approach and update the manufacturers? Well, industry standards, more logically manufacturers, and the scientific community. We want to be sure that all users of Raman spectroscopy have very consistent and very reproducible data. A more important one thing that we don't have today is a capability to recycle data, to export data from different instruments and recycle them. Just a brief introduction of some of the pharmacopoeia that they are in use today, including the ones that have specific chapters for Raman spectroscopy, and the organizations that they are working today in the standardization protocols for Raman spectroscopy. So who are preparing those standards? Well, the standards are prepared normally by organizations, but as well by companies. So for example, companies, organizations like Charisma, this is a consortium of universities and companies. We have been working very hard for the last 4 years to guarantee that we put together protocols that they can be presented to the standardization bodies, and they can validate it and evaluate it, the precision of those. The actual protocols created by Charisma, they are right now under evaluation by the Sense and Elect, the European body for standardization, and hopefully they will be approved within the next few weeks. So the actual state of the art is already reviewed, so we have published some papers regarding that. And the question that is often raised by users of Raman spectroscopy is how many of these changes affect me. Well, in the way that we have been working in the last 4 years, we try to create 2 different paths on the process of standardization. One is for manufacturers like ELODIZ, where we produce instruments that they are going to be very consistent in the way that they are calibrated and the capability to export those data to other devices. But as well, we have created as well what we call virtual calibrations, and we have created software for that. So the people can keep using the instruments that they are today, and then they can do a secondary validation or secondary calibration, external one, where you can process the data to fulfill those standards. So those are available for anyone interested in the Charisma project website. So what are the problems that we have observed, and what are the problems that they are today in the market? This is an example, for example, of a confocal microscope. What we have here is a silicon test, and the silicon test basically using different optical paths. And the numbers that we have in here is the full width at maximum. Now we can see in this graphic on the right that depending on the objective that we have, the full width at maximum is changing. So that shouldn't be the case unless that there is some very serious optical challenge in the system. That is because the optical setup is not perfectly aligned. So it's noticeable when you observe the full width at maximum, and because the shape of the graphic is not consistent. But using silicon as a sole reference point is not acceptable. There is other ways that they can be done to test and to verify the capability of the system, and that has been addressed by the proposal. Another thing that has been analyzed and deeply studied in the project is, for example, what type of pit fitting need to be done for every single step of the calibrations. Many of the manufacturers of Raman, for example, take neon lamps and they analyze the neon peaks, and the majority of the people, what they do is taking the peak maximum. That is unfortunately incorrect, because it introduces some level of deviation depending on the optical setup that you have, and then it can introduce further deviation on the Raman spectrum. As well, neon is a very good sample. It's a very good emission line that is perfectly valid, but introduce certain areas where there are holes in the spectral range. So those areas need to have points extrapolated. So this project has analyzed very carefully how to extrapolate the points to be sure that we have a full continuous and full guarantee on the validity of the data points that we have in there. Some of the users have raised the questions why we don't use multiple illuminations, for example, mercury lamps. Well, the problem of that is that the precision and use of certain lamps is not for everybody users. So this protocol has been created with everybody in mind, to call it in a very broad way. So it's not easy to use certain lamps for everybody. So for that reason, we have center of focusing only one type of illumination, that is the neon. And the protocols cover mostly two wavelengths, 785 and 532. That is approximately 80% of the market. So what happens if we don't do this correctly? What happens is that people just take the neon maximum and then try to extrapolate it somehow. Well, the problem is that we have observed in some of the instruments on the consortium, in the consortium we have approximately 25 instruments that we have analyzed, is that if you overfeed some of the data, then you have problems in the data reproducibility, particularly observable on the CH area of the instruments that we have been using. So peak fitting is quite important, but then as well peak adjustment. So depending is how often you can have system adjusted, then you need to revisit how you make those small adjustments on the system. The protocols start using silicon after the wavelength calibration of the system, but we don't consider that using silicon per se is going to be valid. So we have analyzed what type of silicon. Does silicon introduce an error? Well, silicon is not a unique material. Silicon is often doped with P-type or N-type silicon. So we have analyzed how those affect the center of the peak. We have used as well, for example, reference point from ITO in Japan, the Institute of Metrology, that has characterized fully crystalline silicon material, and they say the center of this peak should be 520.45 plus minus certain deviation. We have analyzed a number of silicon to observe what is the deviation that we can observe from the different ones. Then we have analyzed polystyrene. Polystyrene, for example, is one of the reference materials referred on by NIST, referred by the ASTM. We have analyzed, okay, from all different polystyrenes, which one is the one that we need to use? Because right now the ASTM only refers as polystyrene. Well, there is a lot of polystyrene, unfortunately. There is some deviations that they are quite important, and some instruments behave well, while others behave really badly. So it is important to take the right polystyrene. So we have analyzed, I think, in total about 15 different types of polystyrene, and we have focused our attention only in 3 or 4 that they are fully traceable and they can have reproducibility or good reproducibility on the system across the full broad number of instruments of the consortium. And we have analyzed very carefully what is the polystyrene effect. So we have carefully considered, because polystyrene is one of the most used samples for reference material, we have analyzed the measured values, the ESTM values, and the samples that we can obtain with our systems, and then we have created new tables that they are going to be proposed to ASTM and ISO organizations to reevaluate the tables on peak positions for polystyrene. Another element that is quite important in the Raman calibration is the y-axis, the intensity correction, the relative intensity correction. More and more nowadays, the intensity correction of Raman is important. Surprisingly, many instruments today, they are not corrected for intensity. And the problems that we have in those cases is that the response of the system is not homogeneous. So the intensity, particularly in the CH area for the 785 and the low end for the 532, are very heavily affected by the type of instrumentation that we have. And my colleague James Thomson will explain that in the next talk. So we have paid a lot of attention on how to do those intensity corrections. Nowadays, there is available a number of tools to correct it. For example, some companies prefer to use apologies for this. Sorry, I have to go back. Computer decided to strike. Okay, so some companies work with wet light, what is perfectly fine. Some companies prefer to work with NIST standard, National Institute of Standards Technology, that they produce a number of samples. But for example, those NIST standards, they are very expensive, very rare. Sometimes they are not produced for years. So if you don't have one right now, you need to wait 1 or 2 years. And they are very temperature dependent. So ELODIZ have been developing for the last couple of years a new strategy to try to do y-axis correction for intensity in Raman spectroscopy, and we have developed a series of LEDs that they can be used to correct the intensity. The example that we have here on the left-hand side is a comparison of the correlation factor in between the NIS standard and the ELODIZ standard. So it's a perfect match. With the difference that we're introducing here is that the range can be broader, and we have no problem in terms of the temperature dependence. It's much more stable. And I will try to press the next one. The software is still crashing. Hopefully. So what those protocols have introduced, what is what we have now available in the protocol. So here, Jesus, it's really not working. So here you can see processed data from Charisma. This is what you observe when you take instruments from what they are available today on the market. And on the right-hand side is after processing the data. So the improvement on the system is significantly higher. So the reproducibility and the capability to transfer the data is extremely, extremely important. I'm trying to see if this will go once again. Apologies for those technical problems. So what are the initiatives and the standards that have been generated? So the Charisma project has generated a new protocol in terms of a standardization process that involves neon lamps, silicon test, calcite, and polystyrene, and a new protocol for the intensity correction. All those protocols have been created in 2 different ways. One that is the virtual calibration for actual users, and the other one that is for manufacturers so they can implement those processes directly. There are ISO requests to change the protocols, and all that has been changed as well to coordinate it with a number of entities to be sure that all those protocols are accepted by the Metrology Institute and by the different companies involved. So what is the impact on this? Well, this is an example from the roof database. What we want to have, this is diamond. If you take all the diamonds that you can find in the roof database, you can see that there is a lot of deviations, and we don't know if that is caused by the diamond itself or it's because the instrumentation. Our objective is to be able to revisit all the old data, recalibrate the instruments with the virtual calibration, and double check if those values are precise and concise. So as a summary, we have created new protocols to have more precise x-axis calibration of the devices. We have created new protocols for the y-axis, so we have something that is more robust. We are looking into a number of standards to be sure that all the samples that they are used on the process are very consistent and they are very well established. And we are working with the different organizations to be sure that all the instrumentation from now on can have those protocols accepted as a standard. So the number of partners that have been involved in this project is quite broad. So we have people from different universities, University of Sorbonne, Spanish Council of Science, and a number of private companies that they have been involved in the protocols. If you have any question, we will open later on the process for question and answer after the second topic. So I pass now the presentation to my colleague, James.
One moment, just wait for everyone to load in. And okay, I think I believe everyone should be able to see my screen. So yeah, hello, my name is James Thomson and I'm lead scientist here at ELODIZ. I'm also working primarily on the Charisma project, and I'm going to talk to you a bit more about the, sorry, I don't know if, I'm going to talk to you a bit more about the use of these protocols and why they are so important, with a little bit of practicality mixed in there. Just a reminder, because I don't know if Enrique said it at the beginning, this webinar is being recorded. And can I change slide, please? Thank you. So we're going to start at the with the agenda here. So I'm going to try and get this thing to go away. Hide control panel. There we go. At first I'm going to talk to you about data quality. Data quality is one of the most important things and one of the biggest issues that we've faced as part of the Charisma project. Making sure that your system, the data that you're getting from your system to enable your calibration is of high enough quality to give a good result, because bad results can lead to a bad interpretation. I'm then going to talk about the issues with multi-system Raman, so using different systems, a high-end system, doing lab work, and then moving that down to a production line, to a more industrial-sized system, how that can cause, or where the issues can arise as you're trying to perform that work. And then we'll talk about multi-channel Raman, which is a Raman instrument with multiple channels, and I'm going to talk specifically about one that uses multiple wavelengths. So one of the biggest problems in data quality is the signal-to-noise ratio. There are issues here with this graph, as you can see, where you have quite a sizable amount of noise compared to the amount of signal, and you have two areas where you could say that there are 2 or 3 peaks, depending on how you decide to assign that. And arguably, you could even say that there is only 1 peak in each. This can obviously cause a problem when it comes to peak detection, peak fitting, and your resulting calibration. So you can improve your signal to noise by possibly increasing your laser power if it's safe to do so with your sample, or by taking averages of multiple spectra, which some systems allow innately, other systems you might have to do this manually, but taking multiple averages or accumulations, and this will reduce the noise. Essentially, you will double your signal to noise ratio as you double the number of averages. And that is, so there eventually gets a point where you have to make a judgment on whether you are taking longer to do an experiment to get very good data, or if slightly shorter times will give you satisfactory data. We've done a study as part of Charisma, where we have found that a signal to noise ratio of over 100 is optimal, especially when it comes to the results of peak fitting. And 25 can be acceptable for certain peak types and depending on purpose. But again, if you're looking at the peak position or the peak forward path maximum, but anything below 25 should not really be considered for harmonization. So this kind of expands differently on what Enrique was showing, where he was showing you the data that comes from instruments as they are currently installed in different laboratories and different industry placements, and how we get a wide range of peak positions for a peak that should be at 620.9 according to the current existing standards. And as you can see, after using our Charisma protocol to perform a calibration adjustment or a recalibration, as you wish to call it, you can see that all of the different systems have that peak within the anticipated range that it should be, allowing for comparisons to be made better between different instruments. So this is, again, to expand on that, another way that people look at data, instead of performing things like peak fitting, they will perform correlation scores, so things like HQI or Pearson R's, to look at how closely related two different sets of data are. So I'm looking at these two systems here, and as you can see, it has a correlation score of about 92%. Now, 92% doesn't seem particularly bad, but a lot of thresholds use something like 95% in different industries based on different standards. So these would actually say that these are not the same material, even though I'm well aware that they are exactly the same sample taken on two different systems. What we can do if we just perform our recalibration is we have already reached that 95% threshold of saying that these two systems, spectra, are matching in some way. However, you can definitely see that there is a difference that is based on the resolution between the two. As you can see, the blue line has a much lower resolution. All the peaks seem to be jumbled together, whereas the orange line, you can clearly distinguish different peaks. One method of dealing with this is to try and deconvolute and sharpen the peaks on the low resolution system. This is quite difficult. It requires you to do peak fitting throughout the spectrum, as well as variable adjustment across the range. So as the graph in the middle that you can see here is, you are looking at what we call the resolution curve, where you can see that the resolution is not one static number across the entire spectral range, it varies. And most importantly, it's not a typo. Where I've said that two of those are from model B, they are the same model of spectrometer, and as you can see, the actual resolution varies tremendously between them. I did a very simple deconvolution where I tried to improve this, and as you can see, I've managed to improve our correlation score by a not insignificant amount. I've got another % on our score. As you can see, those peaks now look more, those two spectra now look much more similar than they did previously. The simpler method and easier to implement is the broadening method. Now, the broadening method essentially takes your high resolution spectrum and it makes it try to look like your low resolution spectrum. This doesn't require things like peak fitting, and the variation across the range has a lesser impact on the mathematics that are used to do the broadening. So as you can see, my final one, I've performed the broadening. One of the things that you can see is the intensity of the peaks has changed much more considerably in that orange spectrum after the broadening, but we are getting a much higher score. We're getting close to 99% correlation between these two spectra. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the y-axis deviation. So Enrique was talking about the fact that there are many different reasons for it. One of those reasons is just the type of CCD technology, for example, that you have. So both of these spectra that you see in green are taken from 785 nanometer spectrometers. One of them has a much clearer, much more obvious peak structure in the CH band, whereas the light green, the front illuminated CCD, has a much weaker signal and a much weaker response in that region. That's partially because if you consider that region on the wavelength axis, that region is about here. So you're looking at the difference between these two quantum efficiencies, and that is a significant improvement when you're using back illuminated CCDs. Another large factor is the spectrometer's optics, as well as the optics used for collecting your information. So at the bottom, you can see the transmission curves and how they differ from the same manufacturers, same type of microscope objective, but using the ones that have different magnifying values. So these can obviously impact the result of your data. So that kind of tells you that you need, for each optical path, you need to have individual y-axis correction, even if all you're doing is changing the turret and changing a microscope objective from one to another. The graph over here is showing again that CH region, and it's showing the behavior of the different optical setups within the spectrometer, so either cross CT or double transmission, and the way in which that can affect the resulting data. And lastly, the big one, the one that most people will know about if they have used 532 and 785, is there is a vast difference in the intensity of the CH bands in that region. So again, we're looking at a 785 spectrometer and a 532 spectrometer. These are both the same model of spectrometer, but they have slightly different grating positions, etc., to allow them to be 785 or 532. And you can see that there is a large difference between the intensity that you're seeing in that region. The last problem, again, with multi-system Raman is the other photoluminescence effects that you're going to see in your spectrum when you're trying to perform Raman spectroscopy. As you can see, these are the analysis of the same tablet. One of them has some form of fluorescence, which is interfering with the signal and will affect ultimately the correlation score and possibly peak fitting, depending on how the peak bases that you attribute are calculated, and then how the maths is the algorithms are then used to calculate peak positions, etc. So this is where using baseline corrections, etc., and peak base approximations are really important, but must be used with significant care and require a lot of knowledge to perform. So I'm going to talk to you now about the multi-channel system. So essentially, multiple wavelengths and spectrometers inside one box delivered to your sample by the same device and controlled from the same software. So at ELODIZ, we have our Nigala, which is our flagship Raman system, and it uses a 532 and a 785 system. And we have our Nigala probe, which allows you to look at the same spot with both of those channels at the same time. Essentially, what is really important to us when developing these multi-channel Raman systems is data compatibility between those two channels. So do the spectrum that I get from those two channels, obviously except for issues with photoluminescence effects, do they look the same across both channels on the same device? And then our next problem is the interoperability, or not problem, but our next focus is the interoperability of the data between multiple instruments to monitor the same process. So a very large industrial process would possibly want to use 2 or maybe 3 of these systems or other Raman systems to monitor all of the process at the same time. And that can, if there's not that level of interoperability between the data, that can cause problems in your modeling. And again, data transferability, so that chemometric models that you generate need to be able to match from one system to another to efficiently use these in process control. So to briefly summarize, is data quality is exceedingly important. Once you try and calibrate with bad data, it turns all the rest of your data into bad data. So making sure that you're following any standards and any protocols with the best quality data that you can means that you will have the best quality calibration that you can. Multiple systems and multiple channels of Raman spectrometers have plenty of difficulties with harmonization, as Enrique has talked about, and I've also illustrated. Just making sure that the X and Y axis are getting to a match can have multiple factors involved, and that needs to be looked at very carefully, which we are doing as part of the Charisma protocols currently in a CEN-CELLAC workshop agreement. And finally, the Nigala multi-channel instrument is designed to be the all-singing, all-dancing proof that these protocols work, and we aim to have good interoperability between different instruments, not only within their own channels, but between different Raman, ELODIZ Raman systems. So Thank you very much. And I believe I should stop sharing now.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everybody, for attending the meeting. A couple of very quick questions that have been raised. Those protocols for Charisma are public, so they are going to be published as a standard from Sense and Elect as soon as they are accepted. They are not yet, but hopefully they will be soon accepted. Then the project is to make those protocols available for everybody. So there is no interest or commercial interest on have something like that patented or anything like that. So we want to have everybody with the capability to have those protocols implemented in any way they want. ELODIZ, logically, we have been working on the project for the last 4 years. All products are fully using those protocols upside down. I think we have the most calibrated instruments in the world. We have been recalibrating the instruments in a daily basis to guarantee the consistency of the data that we are generating. They work very, very nicely, I must confess. So the other questions that we have is regarding the access to those standards. Those standards, they have been trying to be made, again, public. We don't try to commercialize any particular standards. ELODIZ do commercialize standards, so they are available through our website and through our distributor partners. You can buy those through the distributors or directly through us. But the intention is that you can have, once you understand the protocols, you can do those processes by yourself. The Charisma project has created software for the virtual calibration. There are 2 software that they are available through the website. The website is H2020 Charisma. Those protocols are available, or they will be made available shortly through the website. I don't think there is anything else. Anything else that you want to comment, James, about the protocols or anything?
Sorry, say again, Enrique.
No, if there is anything else that you want to add. So it's just the 2 questions regarding the access to the standards, the access to the protocols. So the protocols, as I say, they are free to have. You can use them for their online tools, and they are available through the Charisma website.
Yeah, I mean, those tools which are, as we keep working on them, are constantly being expanded, and new ways to use those are being introduced within our software. So it is probably the best way to get the fastest, up-to-date use of these protocols as they're being developed. The Sense and Elect workshop agreement will be going for public commenting, I think, in the next couple of weeks. So if you're interested in that, either email the ELODIZ or ourselves, and we will try and put out a notice that this has gone public and that you can comment on it now. And then that's the easiest way to get early access to what we've written so far and the protocol as it stands.
Thank you, James. If there is any other questions, those will be responded later privately. There is nothing right now that is related to those to the proposal of this webinar and the questions. But if there is any other questions, please do not hesitate to contact us through elodiz.com on our website or through ELODIZ regarding the Charisma project. I think that will close the webinar. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And hopefully you have enjoyed and learned something today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Enrique. Thank you so much, James.
Thank you, Jasmine, for organizing. Much appreciated.
Yes, thank you very much.
Bye.